First anime I ever watched was My Hero Academia. The first manga I ever bought was My Hero Academia. The first video on this channel was not My Hero Academia, but you get where I'm going with this. And while admittedly I'm a little behind the series, it still holds a special place in my heart as it made me interested in what I am today. And so that's why I knew when I got the comment to turn My Hero Academia into a Western, I knew I had to do this one's justice. Bad puns aside, let's get into My Western Academia. Let's get started. A tumbleweed rolled across the barren ground as the clock struck 7. The bells of the clock tower swayed back and forth, sending a haunting melody throughout the town. Two men stared each other down, hands at their sides, trying to read whether they'd be the one to act or react. None of the town's residents were outside, preferring to watch the standoff from behind the safety of closed doors and windows. For years, a ragtag group of misfits called the League of Outlaws had wreaked havoc on Moostar and its neighboring towns. At first, they started off pretty small with petty crimes like shoplifting, nothing that each town's sheriff couldn't handle by their lonesome. Soon the crimes became grander with a couple of train robberies, looting sprees, and eventually peddling an illegal substance called Alpharon, which was known to increase the physical abilities of its user. With the lives of the town residents at a higher risk, several of the sheriffs of each town decided to band together and lead a raid on the League's hideout. Unfortunately, unforeseen circumstances forced the sheriffs to enact their plan before it was complete. In a recent raid, the Outlaws had taken a resident as a hostage, a demolitions expert named Barry Key. Dedicated to serving their communities, a new plan was quickly thrown together to rescue the man. Despite its hasty creation, the plan went off without a hitch. The sheriffs were able to get into the hideout, rescue the hostage, and even apprehend some of the outlaws. However, things were going a little too well. One of the sheriffs, simply known as the Almighty around his town, suspected that a larger unseen force was pulling the strings, and had merely used the hostage situation as a distraction. Realizing this rescue mission had left many of the towns unsupervised, the Almighty hopped onto his horse and raced back to Moostar. When he arrived, he saw that nothing was out of the ordinary. All seemed quiet. Too quiet. The roads were clean and the buildings were still standing untouched, but there wasn't a single soul to be seen. The sheriff dismounted from his horse and cautiously walked through his town, every step echoing off the buildings. The sun was going down, stretching the shadows of everything. The Almighty looked to the ground and saw the tip of one of these shadows moving from his right to left. Someone was coming towards him. He whipped his head up and around and saw a figure lunging at him, ready to deliver a massive punch. The Almighty sidestepped and dodged the attack at the last second, grabbed the attacker's arms, and threw him to the ground, kicking up plumes of dust. When the air cleared, the two men stood face to face, metaphorically. The Almighty's assailant was one that he was all too familiar with. A man with similar build to the sheriff, with a dark fur-lined trench coat and a matching hat. But what made the man distinct, however, was his respirator and his shadowy face. The man was still able to perform basic functions, but where there should have been eyes, there was nothing. The Almighty stood against his longtime foe, One Gun Shigaraki. An ironic name, as the legends carried that he worked his way up the criminal ladder without ever once using a pistol. He won duels and carried out successful heists, all with his bare hands. And while the stories held some truth, the Almighty knew that Shigaraki didn't get to where he was on natural ability alone. Through the years that the two men went up against each other, the Almighty knew Shigaraki to be a heavy user of Alpharon. He had taken such large doses of the drug that one of his arms was significantly bigger and had more defined muscles than the other. He was stronger and faster, but the drug had also damaged his respiratory system, to the point where he had to constantly wear a respirator to survive. To the naked eye, both men moved at the same time. One Gun Shigaraki lunged towards the Almighty, as the sheriff reached behind him for his rifle. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, accompanied by a loud bang of the gun going off. The noise caused all the townspeople to duck for cover. Slowly, a few brave souls gathered up the courage to take a peek at the aftermath. Gun smoke rose high into the sky, droplets of blood pelted the sandy ground. But other than that, all was still. The Almighty and Shigaraki maintained eye contact for a long while, until the Almighty staggered backwards, a large, gaping hole in his chest. Then it was Shigaraki's turn to move, or rather, collapse. Though he had managed to run his giant arm through the sheriff's body, the sheriff also got a shot in with his rifle, where he managed to shatter Shigaraki's respirator. Both fighters lay on the ground, struggling to breathe, clinging to their last bits of life. In the months that followed the final duel between Sheriff Almighty and One Gun Shigaraki, Mustar was overrun by outlaws who were followers of Shigaraki and turned the town into a lawless wasteland. About a week after both men had succumbed to their injuries and had been put to rest, a horde of outlaws rode into the town, hyped up on all for one, brandishing weapons and torches. They burnt down buildings and cut off all methods of travel to and from the town. The townspeople tried to fight back with what little they had, but without any sheriff to look up to for guidance, they were no match for the physically enhanced mob. When the sun rose on the devastation the outlaws had wrought upon Mustar, they remounted their steeds and moved on to the next town, hoping to repeat the process of the night prior. A handful of outlaws stayed behind to govern this new town. Mustar remained under this new rule for a few years, bending to every whim of the League of Outlaws. Very rare was it that any of the town's residents had a luxury that wasn't immediately confiscated by them. The town had become the antithesis of the peaceful place that the Almighty once watched over. Then one day, in the early moments of dusk, a figure entered the town. He was in the town for barely 5 minutes before he was surrounded by the town's new government. Brandishing a variety of weapons, they demanded to know how he found his way into the town, before suggesting he take to leaving, lest he wanted to become a permanent resident of the dirt. The figure's stoic expression didn't change in the slightest at these threats. Instead, he simply lifted his teal hat and reached for his side, where a black whip sat. He snapped the whip at the first outlaw, wrapping it around their weapon and disarming them with ease. The figure pulled the whip back and caught the pistol that was tied to the other end, using it to incapacitate 2 more outlaws. Finally overcoming the initial shock of the figure's movements, the remaining outlaws tried to remain on the offensive. The ones carrying melee weapons rushed at the figure, while those remaining covered them with gunfire. But the figure didn't retreat as they intended to make him do. Instead, he grabbed the reins of his steed and rode into the gunfire, soaring past the 2 outlaws with melee weapons. When he reached the 2 with guns, he stood up and jumped off his horse, still moving at full speed. He seemed to float through the air and landed on the ground with grace. He took his whip, wrapped it around the neck of one outlaw, and threw him into the other one, knocking them both out cold. They fell to the ground as one big heap. The figure turned his attention back to the melee outlaws, who had since managed to stop their momentum and run in the other direction. One of them reached the figure before the other and took a swing with their weapon. The figure dodged and countered the attack with a punch to their gut, winding them. He smashed them in the face with the butt of his whip handle before taking their feet out from under them. The figure stared at the outlaws strewn across the ground when he heard somebody scream. One outlaw remained standing, but they weren't alone. They managed to find and take hold of a young woman who was walking alone. The outlaw held a knife to her throat, laughing maniacally as the idea of victory crossed his mind. He pointed the knife toward the figure, claiming it was over, that his time of playing hero of the town had ended. He scratched his neck with the backside of the blade before placing it back on the woman's throat. The 2 stood off against each other. The only movement was the woman's dress being blown around by the cool night air. Eventually, the figure lowered his arms and started to walk away, despite the desperate pleads of the woman. Out of the corner of his eye, the figure saw movement. One of the other outlaws was standing again and coming towards him. The figure pointed his gun in their direction. The outlaw with the hostage turned his attention to where the figure's gun was pointed, expecting to see one of his allies rejoining the fight. Except all of his allies were still knocked out from the figure's previous attacks. The side of their face flared up with a burning sensation as a loud snap echoed through the night. The outlaw fell to the ground, releasing the woman. Upon her freedom, she ran towards the figure, who was holstering his whip. The woman thanked the figure profusely and even tried to hug him, but he was already gone. She looked around to see where he went and spotted him as he ducked into a building, one that had once belonged to the almighty sheriff. I have to say there were a lot of elements in these two drawings that covered topics that I was less confident about in my drawing abilities. Backgrounds, hair to an extent, not only guns, but guns at harsh angles, and just overall, I'm just pleasantly surprised with how this looks. It might be one of my favorite pieces. To have a counter of how many times I've said that at the end of an episode, but like Sheriff Blackwhip is pretty cool looking, if I do say so myself. But thank you so much, first of all, Galahound, for the suggestion, because I know you've been suggesting this for a while, and I really wanted to make sure I did it justice, and I hope I did. And if you had fun with this video, y'all might want to consider hitting the like button, because I bought this here cowboy hat just for this bit. I didn't. I had it lying around. But I really do hope you enjoyed the video. I know I sure did, especially like the stories were a little hard, but man, I feel like they came out pretty good. Especially, once again, Sheriff Blackwhip's story was actually very fun to write. But that's all I've got for you today. If you want more content, I highly recommend my Mortal Kombat characters as Power Ranger series, or my Star Wars characters as Lantern Corps video. Both of those will be linked on the side. And as always, if you're interested in knowing what kind of music I listen to during this project, there will be a playlist down below. Thank you all so much for watching. My name is KyngPin Creations, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care, everybody.